Millions of people in the Horn of Africa are facing starvation again. Why is this particular region so vulnerable to drought and famine? Is the reason weather or war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Mike Hanna. The Horn of Africa is in the middle of its worst drought in more than 60 years. As many as 12 million people could be facing famines. 2 seasons with no rain have led to crop failures and food shortages in parts of Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti and Somalia. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to leave their homes in search of food, many heading for what has become the world's largest refugee complex. Nazanin Mashiri reports from the town of Dadaab in northeastern Kenya, close to the Somali border.
Bare Noor and her children are hungry and weak. They've walked for days to get here. Bare's husband had to stay back in Somalia. 8-year-old Ibrahim is for now the man of the family. Before they can receive food, they must all be registered through the system. It can be a long and frustrating process. Finally, it's their turn. Flour and other basics will keep them going for just 2 weeks. They also get cooking utensils, plastic bottles and bedding. Now they're on their own. This is Habiba. In her 90s, it's extraordinary a woman so old and frail can walk so far.
We couldn't get enough food because my mother didn't have a wristband and she was too sick to come here. There were no cars, so we had to walk. She's the only family I have left.
They've all fled the drought in Somalia, but northern Kenya is also suffering. It hasn't rained here in years, turning the land into dust. The cattle and the goat herds, which are so vital to the worst affected people, are dying, leaving them with nothing. This is why this family is here. They've lost their farming land, their livestock and their livelihood.
If the drought ends, I will return. If there is rain and peace, I will go home.
The reality is that this could now be their home for a very long time. Nazanin Mashiri, Inside Story.
Joining us now are our 3 guests. In Washington, D.C., Daphne Weisham, a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. She's a climate policy analyst. In Nairobi, Ali Khan Sachu, a financial analyst and chief executive officer of Rich Investments. And in London, Alan Tomlinson, emergency program coordinator at CARE International. Welcome to all of you. Let's begin in Washington with Daphne Weisham. Why do you believe there is recurring drought in these specific areas?
Well, we know as the world warms, we've got 390 parts per million CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere, and what that's doing is it's holding heat in the Earth's atmosphere, and that's warming up certain parts of the globe faster than others. And in East Africa, what we're seeing is a recurrence of drought, a recurrence of basically extreme weather events, and we know from the scientific models that that part of Africa is going to be particularly hard hit, disproportionately so compared to the rest of the planet. So what's happening in Kenya and other parts of East Africa is, unfortunately, is predicted by the scientific models.
Let's go to Alan Tomlinson in London. This, as we hear, there's something predicted, and yet it does appear, certainly to aid agencies and governments, a surprise.
Well, local and international agencies have been forewarning of this since early or late last year and continue the early part of this year. And we're now seeing, as the numbers have been said, around 12 million people affected and malnutrition rates at emergency or crisis levels. And that's why agencies like CARE International are scaling up their response right now, but also looking at long-term resilience programs.
Well, Ali Khan Sachu in Nairobi, this particular point of are people prepared? We hear that this is a pattern, and yet it does appear that it is just not being dealt with in that form of preparation that is needed.
I agree, Mike. I mean, we've known there's been an early warning system in place, and they've been warning for quite some months now as to this impending problem. It's been a little bit like watching something happen in slow motion. We knew this was coming, as your previous guest mentioned. Also, this particular area, I think, is the epicenter of the global warming effect, as your first guest said. But I think there's a great deal of fatigue, especially on the donor side. Typically these sort of interventions have suffered from enormous amounts of profiteering and racketeering. And I think the donor community in particular have sort of taken a step back. Last week you reported on this announcement that the Al-Shabaab spokesman was saying they were going to allow the Americans to distribute the aid within Somalia. And I think without that, we would be watching something much worse. It's a little bit like the Live Aid moment, and I think that moment is now upon us, and that's why we've got all this visibility in the international media. But it seems our reactions are entirely reactive, are just in time, a little late, but really in the medium term we seem to have no resolution other than some very catchy phrases like building resilience. But to me, so far, nothing has been done to save this situation recurring every year going forward.
Alan Tomlinson in London, you said that you knew about this for a long time. Did you warn people? Did you warn those who could actually take the first preactive measures?
Yes, I mean, international agencies like Care International and the UN have been warning about this for a number of months. A number of agencies have talked about what the scale would be like, but have also been looking at how they can scale up themselves, responding to the needs in the region, looking at immediate needs, but also looking at the longer term around food security and natural resource management.
Well, Daphne Weisham, you mentioned their patterns. Is there another pattern coming that is going to make the situation even worse?
I'm afraid so. I'm afraid, as one of your previous guests has mentioned, this particular part of Africa is in fact the epicenter of the climate crisis. We'll also see this crisis playing out in South Asia, particularly in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh. But in terms of the actual drought, the record droughts that we're going to be seeing in the future, unfortunately, this region will be probably suffering the most severe droughts. And I guess the question then becomes, what does the international community owe this particular part of Africa that is so little to blame for the problem of climate change? Is it enough to simply give aid and to work on resilience, or should we be talking about something perhaps more ambitious, like opening up our borders and allowing some immigration from these parts of the world to countries that are most responsible for the climate crisis? Something
that we'll pick up in a moment, but let's just first consider the question of whether it's only weather. Let's look at the situation at Dadaab. For example, there are a number of camps in the vicinity that have been established by the UN. Their total capacity is about 90,000, but it's estimated that well over 4 times as many people are now seeking shelter in and around the town. In a bid to stop the influx, the UN Food Agency has been calling for more aid to be delivered to people inside Somalia, which is considered the worst hit area in the Horn of Africa. But this is hindered by ongoing conflict. And until recently, as we heard, all outside aid was forbidden by the Islamist Al-Shabaab group, which controls large parts of the country. Lack of governance, no outside aid whatsoever, and an ongoing civil war. It's a combination of factors that would appear to not only exacerbate the consequences of drought, but increase the likelihood of famine. Drought, conflict and famine would appear to be inextricably linked. To your view, Alan Tomlinson?
Yeah, I mean, the situation in the Horn of Africa is extremely complex. A number of issues around chronic vulnerability, levels of poverty, conflict, changes in climate. Added to that, food and fuel prices are growing. So all responses will require addressing those complex issues.
Well, Ali Khan Sachu, the complex issue predominantly in Somalia, one of conflict. Is this a root cause of the accentuation of the drought, a massive intensification of the problem?
Absolutely. I think, Somalia has been pretty much a failed state for decades, in fact. So the ability to respond within the borders of Somalia is very delimited, both for those outside actors who want to come in and help, and there's also a political situation where the Al-Shabaab do not want the outside actors to be seen as doing good for their people. So I think you've got a double whammy. You've got a very disorganized situation, and into this situation people are not that keen to operate until we reach a tipping point, as we have reached again now. And I think this is just going to be a recurring thing that we're going to watch happen in front of our eyes every single year. And like your lady said in Washington, I do not think we've come up with any kind of medium-term solution. Can the land sustain the number of animals that the pastoralists want to sustain? No. What solutions have we got in order to give people a different opportunity? None, except put them in a refugee camp in Dadaab, which is, by the way, the fourth largest settlement in the whole of Kenya today. So I just look at the situation and I think that, there are several narratives, but the main narrative is we're just going to watch this happen again and again until we solve the situation within Somalia, and until and also our method of intervention. It's laudable. I'm glad people are concerned. But if you're on the ground and you're watching how these interventions actually happen, it's just a golden flood of liquidity that hits an illiquid system, and there are people in key choke points who actually cream a whole lot of the money that's meant to go in. And this leads to fatigue and disillusion with the intervention all across the world. So it looks very intractable to me, and I don't see how we're going to deal with all these people who seem to be just going from one camp to another.
Well, Alan Tomlinson, your response to that particular statement there about the flowing in of liquidity into this type of situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, there's a number of challenges in the region, but the people in East Africa are very resourceful. We work with communities all over the region, helping them build their resilience, cope with situations like this. However, the current situation of the worst drought in 60 years, some areas not experiencing rain for 2 years, has pushed people to that edge. And now there is a need for some short-term interventions to protect people's lives and livelihoods, but also to build on the community's normal coping systems to cope with this, and that's the things that Care International and other local and international agencies are trying to build on, people's local ability to cope.
But yet we have this recurring situation where you have a crisis, you have aid flooding in, but it does appear to be short-term band-aids, clearly desperately needed, as we see from our reports from that area. But just to follow up again, Alan Tomlinson, this issue of applying bandages to a situation where, as you said, there should have been deeper involvement with these communities, perhaps to allow them to be able to deal with the situation to an extent themselves.
Mm-hmm. The situation in the Horn of Africa often requires long-term predictable funding, so that agencies like Care International can work with communities, with the governments, to prepare for disasters like this and to build their resilience, to naturally look after their own water supplies, their pasture for pastoralists.
Sorry, I just want to go to Daphne Weisham and pick up on a point that she made a little bit earlier, which also calls for some kind of involvement that goes beyond aid or funding. If you could elaborate on that.
Well, I mean, the unfortunate reality here in Washington is that we're still fighting the pushback against the science. There are these climate denialists who essentially are claiming that climate change is not happening. They don't feel the pain that is being felt in the Horn of Africa. They do not feel the suffering that's going on there. It's something very remote and far away. And so we have not changed our policies here in the United States, even though we are one of the top 2 emitters globally, and China has now surpassed us. But The United States has to not only provide finance, as Ms. Tomlinson has suggested, and this is actually a commitment that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has made at past climate negotiations, that by 2020 we will be contributing towards a $100 billion per year climate adaptation fund. But the question, I think, in many people's minds is, will this be enough? And frankly, when you're dealing with water, no amount of money can provide water for countries like this. You really need to be thinking about some alternative strategies beyond building resilience when there's no water.
Ali Khan-Satchu, would you pick up on that from an economic point of view in particular?
I completely agree. I think that point is the main point. You know, how do you build resilience when you don't have any water? And it's a pastoralist community for the most part who require water for their livestock. I just don't think the situation now can sustain the livelihoods that have existed for centuries in that particular area. And I think we've got to think beyond this sort of live aid approach, which is we've got to come in there in a big way. Of course we do. But what do we do with all these people next? Some of them have been languishing in refugee camps for a decade. So I think we've got to really think out of the box. We've got to work out, you know, are we going to be able to reverse climate change? I don't think so. And there's so many, the denial camp is so powerful still. I don't think there is enough traction in the global space to deal with that situation. So now we've got to go and say to ourselves, how do we deal with these 10 million people who are at risk every single year, obviously? And that's what I think we've got to look at, and look at very hard. I mean, it's an incredible burden on a country like Kenya, which is hardly a developed one, that we have so many people, and the numbers probably under-account the actual numbers that are in the country. I, for one, you know, I think we need to look very, very keenly. There are also other issues. I mean, if you look in Ethiopia, and it's being affected right now in the southern part, Ethiopia has ceded enormous tracts of land to outside investors, 300,000 hectares to just one party alone. What's going to happen when this fertile land produces food, everybody's starving, and that food's being exported out somewhere else? So there's so many complexities in this story, and I think we just consistently react to it in a very blinkered manner, you know, in a Bob Geldof way, and say, you know, we've got a real big problem now, we've got to deal with it. And we're going to be doing this to everybody every year. And at some point, people are going to say, we're fed up of hearing about this.
Ellen Tomlinson, CARE is a first responder type organization, obviously doing a very important job, as we are seeing at the moment. Mm-hmm. And yet, what we are hearing here is that essentially the international community should work to put organizations like CARE out of work, to remove these emergency situations. How do you view that argument, and what sort of validity do you think it has?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, agencies like CARE International are working to reduce people's vulnerabilities, reduce the need for these type of interventions. And as the other panelists have talked about, the complexity of the situation, the long-term vulnerability, climate change, weather patterns, land use, require a complex response and require long-term predictable funding to address a number of the issues, and require local and international agencies like CARE to respond to these sort of difficulties in the region.
But what sort of long-term measures are you taking, for example, in terms of ensuring that kind of long-term financing, long-term planning? Because all we've heard about, and all we seem to hear about every cycle of drought, is a short-term response.
Well, CARE is working on a number of climate adaptation projects in the region, helping people manage their natural resources, manage their water sources, and also help pastoralists in the region around grazing lands. And it's looking at those longer-term solutions which require involvement by a number of different actors, the governments, international agencies, local communities. And that's what we're working on. Occasionally we get to a situation where we are now, which requires relief efforts to save people's lives and livelihoods. But our long-term goal is to prevent these type of situations happening.
Daphne Weisham, to touch once again on something that you mentioned, opening up borders, taking in refugees, preventing them from being bottled up in these perennial refugee camps. How realistic is that type of approach? An approach that actually says the advantaged north, speaking economically, has a greater responsibility to the undeveloped south than it's exercising at present?
Well, it's already happening in parts of the Pacific. For example, there are some islands that are already going underwater, and countries such as New Zealand are opening up their borders to bring in some of these so-called climate refugees. What hasn't been raised, as far as I know, at the international level is the proposal to do the same for the Horn of Africa, for countries that are riddled with drought. And of course, in the United States, when you talk about immigration, essentially right now there's a very strong backlash against opening our borders any more than they already are, because we're concerned about our ability to support these refugees. And yet, in the absence of that sort of compassionate response, I think what we will see is a continuation of the very energy policies that are driving this climate crisis. For example, the U.S. is now collaborating with Canada to build a giant pipeline from the tar sands. The tar sands is considered a climate time bomb, a climate bomb, in the sense that it requires so much energy to extract the tar from the sands, turn it into oil to be consumed globally, that you might as well be burning coal in your car. It's actually worse than coal. And the reason we're pursuing this is we're so concerned about energy security, because we're concerned about instability in the Middle East. That's what's driving our energy policy, not concern or compassion for the eventual consequences of this continued reliance on very carbon-intensive sources of energy. We know we can move towards clean energy options. We have the technology. We just don't have the political will.
Ellen Tomlinson, as somebody from an agency which is on the sharp end of the results of these things that we are hearing coming from a myriad of factors, is there a sense of frustration? Is there a sense that people are not listening when you say that long-term measures need to be addressed, whatever they are?
This is the challenging thing about this particular region, is the myriad things that are causing these crisis situations. We have worked with a number of international agencies and local agencies talking about how we can tackle these long-term problems, but also occasionally, as we are in now, short-term solutions are required to help people who have reached the edge in terms of walking for days to get to camps, or they've lost all their livestock. So we are looking at responses on both levels, at long-term and also short-term.
Ali Khan Satchu, very briefly, what do you think can be done to ensure some approximation of a medium, if not long-term solution?
Well, I think both your speakers have hit the nail on the head. We have a short attention span in the year 2011. We got incredible number of problems swirling all around the world. I think the oil price is actually going much higher, which will add further pressure to this exact situation. And I think we have an inability to think long-term about remote places in the world. You know, our compassion is ignited, we intervene, and then we forget all about it. And I'm just not sure how we square this circle. And I think unfortunately, I have a very bleak picture. I think we're just going to watch this happen over every 12 months going forward. And I think these people are going to be bottled up in these awful refugee camps with no hope, no opportunity. And I think it's entirely unlikely Western countries who have a fortress mentality are ever going to allow these people to come in the numbers that are required.
Well, as we ponder over all this exceedingly complicated situation, perhaps to remember that some 5 children are dying by the day in these camps. Hundreds of thousands of people are on the road with no food, no water, and the situation dire and very, very desperate. But my thanks to our guests, Daphne Weisham, Ali Khan Satchu, and Ellen Tomlinson. And thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Mike Hanna. Goodbye for now.